Okay, Ecclesiastes 8. Ecclesiastes chapter 8, where Solomon now is continuing his musings. We said that he kind of changed from this depressed, sober idea, nothing new under the sun, and he went through his how that everything is vanity. And he still says that, but he was living life without God under the sun, S-U-N. But he realizes there's more to life than that. And we see by the time that we get to chapter 12, he's going to just full-fledged say, remember your Creator in the days of your youth. But now he's still mixing in a little bit of philosophy, but mostly he's dealing with inevitabilities, just things that he has seen under the sun. A worldly wise man. As we saw last week, or as we named chapter 6 and 7, the wise advice from a vain old man. Well, we see that he's continuing that, and he's looking now in chapters 8 through halfway through chapter 9, verse 12 there. He talks about authority and the mysteries of life and the certainty of life. And so we begin here then. The life under the sun is filled with contradictions and complexities and certainties. Only when we realize there is a time for every purpose under heaven. Remember chapter 3. Do we understand God's sovereign control? When we understand that it's under God's sovereign control, we find true meaning in life. Really, life without God has no meaning. Let's eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die and we cease to exist. Is that true? No. And so God has placed in every one of us a God-sized vacuum. Every civilization ever discovered or uncovered in archaeology, they've had some type of afterlife. The happy hunting grounds, nirvana, whatever. But we know that that's all a derivative or all a counterfeit for what God promises. There's a time and place under heaven, and heaven is with God. Now, as we see this, then I've divided it into three different sections. We see the contradictions in chapter 8, verses 2 through 9. Then we see the complex mysteries, things that just you ponder, but you realize you just have to leave it with God. And that is in the rest of the chapter, verses 10 through 17. And then the first 12 verses of chapter 9, you're going to see the certainty of death. And that's the one inevitability. I guarantee you, if the Lord doesn't come, then within 50 years, everybody here probably will be dead. Well, wait a minute, you're so young. You'll still be a young lady by then. I don't know. But as we, I go up and have coffee with Al today, and a lot of the guys up there are like 70 years old, or like 80 in their 80s and 90s. And they realize, it's one of those unspoken but certain things. We were talking about, today, one doctor after another, that people that they go to. And so it's kind of a depressing, and yet it's kind of a refreshing. I go up there and say, yeah, that's the reason I come up here, fellas, because I feel young around you guys. And so they laugh about it, but it's inevitable. And the sad thing about it is each one of us has seen the inevitable with people a lot younger. I mentioned the bittersweet moment I have with Mother's Day because my mother died when she was only 40, just turned 41. And so we see that he says now, but the first thing then is he says, really this section I think is more how to get along with authority and get along with people and with the things you just can't understand. There was a book written back several years ago, Don't Sweat the Small Stuff, and everything is small stuff or whatever. And so, but with us, we can cast all our cares upon the Lord. And so as you read this, and what makes Ecclesiastes so difficult is because we see a man trying to think outside of God, but we can fill in the voids over and over again in his reasoning. But then he comes around and he's starting now to fill in the voids himself. And so we begin in verse 2 of the book of Ecclesiastes in chapter 8. He says, I say a king's commandment for the sake of, or he says, keep the king's commandment for the sake of your oath to God. Do not be hasty and go from his presence. Do not take your stand for an evil thing, for he does whatever pleases him. Now, we don't live in a kingship. We don't live under absolute sovereignty of a king. And it's one of those difficult things for Americans to understand. We have rights, supposedly, but when everybody's demanding their rights, then really nobody has them. But we see that he says that really under a king, and now this is another one of these great passages of where you can take it either way politically. Because, you could take this passage and go with, if I was an Englishman back in the Revolutionary War, then they could go to this passage and say, see, you colonists need to stay under your king. And so then you can go to other places where it talks about freedom and so forth. And then the slavery people, well, see, even it talks about slavery and back and forth. So people can take different sections of the Bible out of context and what he's saying. But what we must realize is ultimately the king that we serve is the King of heaven. And so he says here, do not be hasty in his presence. One thing you got to learn to deal with, whether it's a sovereign king or your boss, is how to treat them. How to treat them with deference without treating them like you're falling down and kissing, worshiping their feet or kissing their feet or whatever. And so how do you have poise and respect in front of authority? That's one thing that you'll learn in boot camp. You better respect authority. And so we see that he says, don't take your stand for an evil thing. So if you're going to take a stand, you want to make sure you're willing that you're on the hill to die on. So don't take your stand for things that are wrong. Now, in verses 4 and 5, or 3 and 4, he says, first of all, keep your loyalty. But he says, his king, he says, where the word of the king is, there's power. And who may say to him, what are you doing? So you don't question the king, or if you do, if he asks your advice, that's one thing, but even with that, you've got to be careful. He's saying, you got to treat the person in absolute control with a lot of deference. And this is the one thing that younger generations today, we don't have to, nobody has authority over me. And they talk about the different generations and all that. But if you want a job, you better learn how to please people, please the king, or whatever. And so this is just obvious rationale that he's talking about here. But he says it is absolute. And you want to be careful with people who do have absolute authority, or whether it's your job or whatever. They might not be able to take your life, but they can sure change it. And so that's why it's very important with that badge that a guy wears when he comes up next to your car. You got the little blue light in back. If all these people that are cursing at them and do all these different things, and they think they're going to win the battle. Well, that badge, you might not like the man. I like that, you salute the rank, you don't salute the person. But that represents something. And, it's so sad to see so many of these young men that are getting killed because they never learned that. And you just don't fight with authority. Or with the state or whatever. Now, if there are reasons to do it, and that was very interesting with the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson, and really it was him and John Adams. John Adams added a lot to that he never got credit for. But he attacked the king personally and not the parliament. He realized that the parliament was gaining more and more power. But he didn't want to go after the people. he went after the king, and he said he's derelict in his duties. He does this, and he does this, and he does that. A whole list of things that the king. And so the parliament says, well, but he wasn't very popular anyway as far as a king. But politically, he went after the king. And even with that, though, you had, the redcoats were under the sovereignty of a king. And so we see that he says there are problems. And this is what he says. There's a principle of being loyal and a good, loyal citizen. You just don't go after the rabble-rousers. You don't listen to all the conspiracy theorists all the time, or much of the time. Now, you do listen to criticisms at times, or many times you will listen to a debate or someone who has a different opinion. But if you're just going after people that are always wanting to overthrow the boss or and unfortunately, churches are like that, where there's just somebody in that church that they've got to keep everybody else straight, especially the preacher. And there again, pastors, and not me being a pastor, and this is what Solomon's going to say. Yeah, I'm a king, but I've got my own insecurities. We're going to see that in a moment. So I realize I'm not perfect, and I am open to criticism. I try to be. I don't want attacks, but I do want. Don't I ask you people at times? Okay, what can we do different, or do you see something wrong in my approach or whatever? Well, when I ask that, I want your honest opinion. Well, Pastor, I really don't. Okay, hit me with it, whatever. Because I know that, I want to appeal to everyone. But that's, really, the king is the audience for me as far as trying to, I got to win people to the Lord. And of course, my king, but I'm a representative of the king. I think you understand what I'm saying. I got to win people over. He doesn't win the souls is wise. So I want to keep people happy. And but the problem is, and we see in verse 6, he says, because every matter there is a time and judgment. Okay? Every king has to there's a time for a time and a judgment. Though the misery of man increases greatly. So he says there's a time for judgment, and as a king, there's a lot of times it's very weighty. If there's a dry spell, then thousands, possibly millions of my people are going to be affected. If there's an invasion, or even a threat of invasion, I've got a lot on my plate. And so if my people's misery is increasing, mine is too. And so he says, for he does not know what will happen. So even the king has uncertainties. No one ever gets to the point where they don't have uncertainties. And so this is one of those situations where everyone wants to be independent and everyone wants to be their own boss. And yet when they are boss, they want total conformity. It's interesting how that happens in life. And so we see that he does have his problems. We see in verse 7, he says he doesn't know what's going to happen, so he's uncertain. And then he realizes in verses 8 through 9, as we just said, he says, no power. First of all, I don't have any power over your spirit. I don't have any power over other people. Now, I may have I can make life miserable for you, but in the end, it'll be you that's going to respond. And as someone said, it's not your circumstances that make or break you, but it's how you respond to them that makes or break you. So I can't have everybody's response the way I want it. He says, and no one has power in the day of death. Boy, you learn that as a pastor. You do pray for people, but in the end, it's whatever God wants. And then life is going along just perfectly, and all of a sudden you get a telephone call and you realize someone has just died that you love very much. So you don't have power over that. He says, and the wickedness will not deliver them who are given to it. So you just learn that you can't control people's actions, you can't control their thoughts, and you can't control their decisions. And so when they go off into the path of wickedness, You just sit back and, you can't control them. You just, many times you watch what happens. And so, and that's true with so much in life. And so, verse 9, as he continues here, he says, really, this I have seen, and he's going to say this many times, this is I've seen, this I've applied, these are the things that I've considered. He'll say that many times in these passages we're reading. But he says, this I have seen and applied my heart to every work that is done under heaven. There is a time in which one man rules over another to his own hurt. Now, what does that mean? He's saying that, yes, I rule over someone else, but sooner or later, the way I rule over them is going to affect me. So if I mismanage my rulership, and every one of us have certain levels of authority, whether it's a parent, whether it's an older brother or sister, whatever. We see that, but you mismanage it. You mismanage it to your own hurt. As a pastor, life is uncertain. I don't know what's going to happen the next day to so-and-so or so-and-so. And yet, if I mismanage what God has given us and given me, then it's not only going to affect me, but it's going to affect the whole church. So whatever authority you have, sooner or later, if you mismanage it, it's going to come back to bite you. I guess basically is the way he says it. So be careful the way you deal with people. The king is to be respected, but the king respects if he wants to get things done. So first of all, there's contradictions in authority. There's the absolute, and yet there's the uncertainties of authority. Now, in verses 8, the rest of the chapter, 10 through 17, verses 10 through 17, he gets into some of the philosophical things again. Why does God seem like he blesses some and not others? Notice, then I saw, here again, okay, here he is. He's experienced, this is the things he's seen in life. He has seen. He says, that I saw the wicked buried who had come and gone from the place of holiness. So first of all, I've seen wickedness in high holy places. I've seen counterfeits and frauds, phonies. Boy, haven't we all? Just think about it. I don't want to go to church there because, well, just everybody. Well, if you are going to let that keep you from going to church or being with God's people, you'll never be with God's people. For one thing, you're probably in some area, if somebody really critiques you like you critique them, they're going to find some inconsistencies in your life. And so he says, I've seen this, and he said, I've seen a lot of phonies and frauds, and but they're forgotten in the city that was so done, or at least their wickedness was. And he says, I don't understand it. He says it's vanity, because the sentence against the evil work is not executed speedily. Then again, Lord, if you did that, won't you just go ahead and whack them right now? Sometimes we have to wait to see what God's going to do. And that's hard to do, isn't it? Especially in today's climate. I think of a man who, he was well known in the south county of where I was the pastor. And he was a man who had a little bit of problem with the bottle, but he was very high up in certain circles. And he was out drunk one Friday or Saturday night, and he killed a young person at the wreck and so forth. He was able to escape that because of his cronyism and just the way the lawyers, and I don't know, I'm not saying the judges were unfair, but the jury was pretty well influenced by what a great man he was and all that. So he beat the rap. I talked to his son about 5 or 6 years later. And his son said, Dad died a very sad death. Yeah, he beat the rap, but he didn't beat his conscience. And he died an early death. Now, to me and to everybody else who heard about that, we know everybody in the county knew. that he got off. But he didn't get off. But you had to wait until God did the work. And sometimes you don't see it. Sometimes they just, well, it looks like, well, they died with, 2 golden spoons in their hand and everything else. But yet, God has a way of reckoning. Can we trust God for the consequences? Can we trust God in the injustices? And there are many out there we could talk about, and that's true. That's going to be true in every society. The media loves to hone in on a certain injustice, but then they will totally ignore another one, because if it doesn't fit their agenda, then they ignore the injustices and just pick out the ones they want. But there's injustices on every side, including in some of the best Christian institutions. Sometimes it just doesn't work out. And sometimes people draw the wrong conclusions at the wrong time. Can we trust God in those situations? Can you trust God with your reputation? He says, why does this happen? Verse 12, although a sinner does evil 100 times and his days are prolonged. Why is that? Why is it that a sinner could be 100 times worse than the righteous person, and their days seem to be happy? Long days as quality days in the Bible, not length of days as far as years and years. But whenever you see long days, it's talking about these are quality days, good life that it's talking about in the Old Testament. That's one of the idioms that it doesn't mean that you're going to live to be 140 years old. It does mean that if you live to be 40 years old, it's going to be full of good stuff. But he says, yet I surely know that it will be well with those who fear God. And I see this, and yet I know that, and I preach this, Jesus doeth all things well, and no good thing will he withhold from them who walk uprightly, and all good things work together for good for them that love God. I know that, but it sure is hard to reconcile it, isn't it? And so he says, but it will not do well for the wicked. Now notice he's getting into it. He's saying, I realize in the end it's not going to do well for him to prolong his days, which are a shadow. It's just a short life, because he does not fear before God. So I realize that, but I don't realize it. I realize it, but Lord, why is it taking so long? And so don't we have those frustrations and conflicts in life? And so there's complex mysteries there. And so we see that in verse 10, 11. Then verses 12 and 13. And then verses 14, he says, this is vanity which occurs on earth, that there is a just man to whom it happens according to the work of the wicked. Now, in other words, just men are hurt by the wicked. And again, there's a wicked man to whom it happens according to the work of the righteous. I say all is vanity. This is certain times that we all make bad choices. And can I hurt someone even though I'm the high and holy pastor? No, I'm not a high and holy, but you understand. Well, this guy should have known better. Folks, I've hurt people. And as much as I want to live for the Lord, I'm not perfect. Now, of course, the first thing you want to do is make sure that, even in at the Lord's table, Lord, if there's anything, please expose it to me. Let me, because I want to go to that brother. I want to go to that sister to make sure that everything is all right. And so that's part of our communion service. But at the same time, it happens on both sides. So be careful with just downing the wicked all the time. The wicked aren't always wicked, and the righteous aren't always righteous. But how do you reconcile that? There again, we're talking about a man who has lived life and he's seen it all, as he said over and over again. Now in verses 15 through 17, we see now that he's saying, first of all, he says, so I commended enjoyment. So first of all, just enjoy life with the power that God has given you to enjoy life. You can't control the circumstances, but you can control your reaction to them. And what does the Lord tell the Christian? Now here's where you fill it in. What does the Lord tell you as a Christian? In all things, give thanks, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus concerning you. So if you've done everything you can and it still, goes haywire, then you can know that God's hand is in it. And so, and then there again, can I thank God? Notice he doesn't say give thanks for all things, but it's give thanks in all things. In other words, when we're down, whenever it's really going bad, we do have a friend that sticks closer than a brother, don't we? We have the Lord Jesus. And as we've seen many times, the great men and women in the Bible, they learned how to encourage themselves in the Lord their God. One of my favorite passages is 1 Samuel chapter 30, verse 6, and David encouraged himself in the Lord his God. Right when he was probably the most dangerous time in all of his life, where his own men were talking about stoning him. And so, Lord, help me to be that way, that I can trust you, and I want to encourage myself in you. So we realize that God has given us the power to enjoy life. After all, did not the Lord say the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace? So Lord, help me to attain that. When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. Then we see that there's limits to wisdom, because he goes on in verse 16, I've applied my heart to know wisdom, to see business that's done on the earth, even though one does not even though one sees no sleep day or night. I mean, I really tried to find all the, I tried to put it all together about this world. And I realized that wisdom has its limits. I mean, you just can't know everything, and you don't have the answer for everything. But you can trust. But what would we say? Now, he's talking as a man under the sun. But what would we say about that? I don't have the wisdom, but I have a God who does. And if any man lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all men liberally and upbraids not. That's James chapter 1. So you notice he kind of leaves those out as a man under the S-U-N. But since we are under the S-O-N, we know where the answers are. And so as a man thinking outside the box, or outside of godliness, then he's there. But now he's, as we say, he's still coming around, but he's still going from worldliness to godliness to worldliness to God, back and forth. But then in verse 17, he tells us to search for these reasons. He says, he says, then I saw all the works. Notice, then I saw, then I knew, then I considered, then I. So this is all his experiences. Then I saw all the work of God, that a man cannot find work that is done under the S-U-N. For though a man labors to discover it, yet he will not find it. Moreover, though a wise man attempts to know it, he will not be able to find it. So he is saying, you're not going to find out the reasons why people do the things they do. You're not going to understand for even some of the works that are done. You'd like to, but for one thing, your brain is limited, and secondly, your wisdom is limited. And so you're not going to know everything. And so the person who tries to learn everything is going to be, as Mark Twain said about the Platte River, he said it's a mile wide and an inch deep. Well, it's going to be very shallow. And so we see then there's the problems and the contradictions of reality, or the mysteries of life. Just certain things, it's all real, but it just doesn't make sense how that it all comes together. How can man be so crazy and yet the world still stay together? I look back at church history, and it's a major miracle that churches exist today with all the conflict and all the problems and the sin that we've come through as a church. I mean, as church history. And so it's just a miracle that we're here. But God said that the gates of hell will not prevail against his church. So I can understand why God has blessed us but he does. And so, again, and by the way, it really looks, I mean, what's going on in churches today in America and the United States, just, it saddens me. Just the rank evil and perversions that so-called churches are promoting. And yet, and we know that those people, most of them aren't saved, and they're the phonies and wicked and all that. But that doesn't mean that we have to be the phonies and wicked. There's always the remnant, and there's a whole doctrine in that. So we see, and now he comes to one final thing. He's talked about the authority, talking about conflicts and authority. He's talked about the mysteries of life and things that just cannot be understood. And now, I hope we can get through this, but now he's going to talk about mortality. That's the one thing that we all put in the back of our mind. We have not had any major wars in my lifetime. Now, we did have the Vietnam War, and I still, that was my service time and so forth, and I did see a little bit of what some countries have gone through when they've lost millions of people. As I told you about the British Marine that I met last Memorial Day. It's kind of interesting. Never will forget it. And we started talking, and he said, "You Americans, you really puzzle me." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because you guys really don't honor your dead. I mean, to us, it's Remembrance Day, not Memorial Day, and so Veterans Day for us is for veterans. Well, to them, it's Remembrance Day because 100 years ago, a little over 100 years ago now, these young 18, 19-year-old kids marched off to war, and in some villages, 90% of them didn't come back. And the ones who did were mangled beyond recognition in many cases." He says, Remembrance Day to us, and I remember my grandma, that's what he would say, how that they would just go and they'd put a flower on a grave or whatever, and it was a very solemn day. He said, so we really honored our, even for World War I dead. But you guys have a Memorial Day for everybody, and then you have a whole month for gay rights or gay appreciation. He says, it just doesn't make sense. And I said, guilty. What can you say about that? And so certain things you just don't understand. You can't change your country as much as you'd like to. If that's the one reason people get into authority. I want to get in and change things. Well, as a pastor of 45 years now, or 47 years, I've learned there's just certain things you can't change. Now, you try, and it's the Word of God who changes things. But in the end, you just have to realize, whatever's going over in the Middle East, you're not going to change. You're not going to change what's going on in Russia, and you're not going to change anything in your backyard as far as people. Sure wish I could. I've got a couple of neighbors I'd love to see come to know the Lord. Okay, so then the certainty of death. So notice, I hope we can do this in the minutes remaining. Now I considered, notice in chapter 9, verse 1. I've considered, I've thought, I've seen, whatever. We've seen all this in my heart so that I could declare it all. I wanted to know it all so I could tell everybody all about it. But unfortunately, that the righteous and the wise, their works are in the hand of God. So I tried my best to learn it all, but I've learned that I just got to leave it in God's hands. People know neither love nor hatred by anything they see before them. All things come alike to all. Why do people love certain things? Why do people hate certain things? Why can't they have peace in the Middle East? All these different things. And the more you try, the worse it gets. And by the way, I'm glad to see that there is some peace in the Middle East now. And I hope that our president and whoever else can bring it, but it's not going to last long. And I don't understand all that. One thing happens to the righteous and the wicked. One event happens to the righteous and the wicked. To the good, the clean and the unclean, to him who sacrifices and him who does not sacrifice. All is the good, so is the sinner. He who takes an oath as he who fears an oath. So there's just certain things, that these events happen, and you can't control it. There are certain people that, they take a great oath, whatever, and then things happen to them, and then there's things, as they said earlier, that never took an oath to do good or whatever, and they come out better. Why? So he says, you just have to leave it with God. There is an evil in all that is done under the sun. The one thing happens to all. There again, three things that control your life as far as how you respond. And that's people, circumstances, and things. You can't control people. You have a hard time knowing what circumstance is coming. And things break apart. Can you control any of those? All you can do is manage them, be prepared for what you think can happen, but in the end, you leave it to God. Do you not? You can't control. This person, they're really coming along fine. You see them growing in the Lord and everything. Boom. And then the other person that you didn't think was going to ever do anything for God, and now they're one of your main people. It's interesting how that works. And so we leave those results to God. Truly, hearts of the Son of Men are full of evil, madness in their hearts while they live. We're a bunch of crazy people. After that, they are dead. They go to be dead. Yeah, but for him who is joined to the living, there is hope. For a living dog is better than a dead lion. Now, here again, he's getting into worldly philosophy. It's better to be, It's better to be a live chicken than a dead duck, and all these different terms that people say. But basically, he's saying, the worst thing that can happen to us is death. Now, we know that physical death is not the worst thing that can happen to us. Fill in again, what's the worst thing that can happen to a person? The second death. So notice he's just still going with, better to be a live dog than a dead lion. Well, maybe. But then again, absent from the body, present with the Lord. And so sometimes, and precious in the eyes of the Lord is the death of his saints. So you feel in all kinds of things. So don't read Ecclesiastes and feel like you just have to go along. It's inspired, but it's inspired in a situation that makes you think, wait a minute, he's wrong. And so if you read this and so try to pick out where he's wrong in his thinking, then you start growing because you start realizing, hey, there's other Bible verses that counter how he's thinking. And so, first of all, then we see there's certainty of death. There's a problem. Death happens to all, the righteous and the wicked. Anything is better than death. And then verses 5, he says, for the living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing. And here he goes into, again, we know that there is life after death. To him, he's still thinking of fatalism. He says, and they have no more reward. Their memory of them is forgotten. Their love, their hatreds or envies, nothing. And nevermore will they share. We know that, love, when a person dies, to an unsaved person, their loves, their hatreds, their envies, their memories, everything perishes. The only thing that we said earlier, that's why so many people look for legacy. Something to be remembered by. Well, what does it matter if you gain the whole world and lose your own soul? Your memories might die here on earth, but there are certain things that God holds you to account forever. And so that's not true again. So memories don't, all these things don't. Now, so that's the problem. Now here's the principle. In verse 7 through 12, he says, go eat your bread with joy. So enjoy life, drink your wine with merry heart, for God has already accepted your works. Let your garments always be white, the idea of being righteous and so forth, and let your head and, and let your head lack no oil. There again, the needs of life, anointing, and so whatever the idea of blessings. So live a righteous life and do good and to your fellow man and so forth, and then make sure that you're in a place where God can anoint you and give you blessings. Okay, good. So he says that's one of the things we can enjoy life, wealth. And I like this. That's interesting. We saw in the last lesson his major bitterness was women. And he had 1,000 of them. Now notice what he tells, as an old fool, what he tells young people. Live joyfully with the wife whom you love all the days of your vain life, which he has given, God, has given you under the sun, all your days of vanity, for it is your portion, and in the labor which you perform under the sun. So just enjoy life, the goods that you can acquire. Keep your nose clean. Enjoy your wife. Notice he didn't say wives. See how he is so conflicted. He's a double-minded man. He's got all, and folks, that's one of the saddest things is when I deal with men in their 70s and 80s, and they've lived all kinds of sordid lives, and they have some worldly wisdom, but they're still so conflicted in their souls. And this is the way he is right now. He's got to be in his late 60s now. He died at 70, so that means that to us he died young. But he says, live joyfully with the wife and so forth. Then in verse 10, he says, whatever your hand finds to do it with all your might. Now that's true. Okay, the one thing you're going to find in life, whether you're saved or unsaved, is find something to work for outside of yourself and do it. You got to have a cause bigger than yourself. Something where you enjoy what you're doing. That's the best, advice. Blessed is the man whose job is also his hobby. Now, as a Christian, the Lord tells us, whatever your heart or your hand says, do it as to the glory of God. Now, there, Paul was talking to slaves. And boy, we don't want to talk about slaves. It's too sensitive of a subject. But there again, a whole different mindset. And yet the very people who want to talk about slave or hate slavery and reparations, they're into all kinds of slavery, whether it's human trafficking or drugs or child molestation. By the way, they're advocating children to be mutilated and all the rest. So we see that the very people talking about the evils of slavery, there again, the way that people think. And we could pick out things in their lives, but Lord, help me to be consistent in these areas too. Amen. And so learn how to enjoy life, your wealth, your work, because all this is going to happen to all. And then this is one of those famous verses that many people have heard. The race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor rich to the men of understanding, nor favor to all skill, but time and chance happen to them all. Simply because you have wealth, simply because you have your strength, that you're wise, doesn't mean that everything in life is going to work out for you. Now, to many people in Christianity, they want to go a little bit too far with it. But one time I was talking to a man, and I told him, I met a guy with your same name, and I met him in prison. And I was just kind of kidding. And I'd just been to a prison ministry, and he had the very same name of a man that, at the time, he was a little, I don't want to get too much, he's a little cocky, let's put it that way. He thought he was a great theologian, but I never thought of him one. But I said, hey, so-and-so, guess what? What a great coincidence. And he said, Dan, there are no coincidences in life. I'm going, okay, I understand. God does control everything, but there are times when we don't know exactly, and it does look like a chance. So how much does God control it? And there you get into all the levels of human will and God's will and all that. I don't know. In fact, I'm not going to spend my life worrying about it. I'm not going to get into the preordination of God. And like the Presbyterian preacher that fell down the stairs and broke both legs, and he said, "Praise the Lord, that's over." Well, no, maybe we need to put some guardrails up or whatever. So there again, and then of course, if you go too far in that area, then you get into fatalism. If you go too far the other way in the human will, then you get into humanism. So those two extremes. So somewhere in the middle, there's the truth. I don't know where the middle is. So I'll just leave it alone. There again, that's what Solomon is saying. Just enjoy life. Don't get into all this stuff that you don't understand. And so he says, enjoy life. He says, a time and chance is going to happen to us all. And he says, and we can't control the future in verse 12. For a man does not know his time. Like a fish taken in a cruel net. Wait a minute, little fishies are pretty, aren't they? Those cruel nets. What are you doing to that poor little fishy? Like birds in a snare. Those beautiful birds. So the sons of man are snared in an evil time, when it falls suddenly upon them. Oh, isn't that unsettling? Here we end up, I don't know what's going to happen to you tomorrow. But God does. So do I go through life just always fearing it, or being frustrated by it, or doubting it? Or do I cast all my cares upon God and say, Lord, with this small brain of mine, you're going to take the things I don't know. And everybody, I like what I think it's Henry Blackaby said, God will give you jobs that are too big for you. You think of his motherhood. Did you learn everything that you needed to know before you were a mother? No. Do you know everything about motherhood now? No. But at the same time, you sure ask for wisdom, and you learned God's wisdom as well as human wisdom by experience. Did you not? So it is. And that we go with. Us men always talk about the ladies. Been married 45 years this coming month, and still kind of wondering about things. So for sure, it's hard to have a perfect marriage when only one of us is perfect. No, in fact, it's more her than me. Okay, any questions or comments about tonight? It's kind of a frustrating and yet a enlightening type of thing. Can we just leave it with God, the things we don't understand?